Welcome to Calvary Campus Livestream. We're happy you're here. During this series, our building will become a classroom, and in this case, your living room too. We will be going through Mere Christianity, a book written by C.S. Lewis for both the believer and the skeptic. Join us as we take a philosophical approach to understanding basic Christian doctrine. And now, here's tonight's instructor, Mike Gaglione.
All right, welcome back, y'all. This is the old-fashioned way that we used to do it before lapels. We got a nice microphone with a wire that goes straight in so nothing can go wrong, and hopefully this creates a better viewing experience. I'll start from the beginning. If you're joining us for the first time, or if you missed the last couple weeks, we went through section 1. Section 1 of the book talks about, does God exist? Is transcendence something? Is that real? And C.S. Lewis walks us through a progression where he proves through morality that something like a mind is behind the universe. When we get into section 2, the question becomes, okay, if there is something like a mind behind the universe, if I believe that God exists, then, wow, there's a lot of religions to choose from in the world, so how do I choose the right one? And so we talked about that. What's true in each religion, and what's at the fundamental core of those religions? C.S. Lewis talks about how Christianity is unique, especially because it has the person of Jesus Christ. And so primarily that's what we talked about. And the idea that Jesus wasn't just a good moral teacher. In fact, he couldn't even have been a good moral teacher because one of the caveats is he claimed to be God, and he claimed that his purpose was to die. And so Lewis sets up what's called the Lewis trilemma, that Jesus was either a liar or a lunatic, or he was Lord of the universe, and God became man and bridged the gap between us so that we could have a relationship with God. And that's central to what Christianity believes. So we walked through that in section 1, walked through that in section 2, and now here we find ourselves in section 3. Now section 3 changes where we go from kind of the cerebral stuff. Some of you guys have been complaining about like the head type stuff that we've been talking about. It's too intellectual. I'm so sick of it. All right, fine. No more intellectual, because we're basically getting into Christian behavior. If I believe this is true, what do I actually do, right? Our beliefs actually create realities and futures. And so because I believe that I'll fall if I walk off the ceiling or the roof of a house, I don't walk off of a roof. Or, just down the line, it's like our beliefs actually shape the way that we live this life. And so if we believe Christianity is true, then there's going to be a way that we actually act on that belief. So this whole section is about changing from our cerebral, intellectual belief into our actual actions. So a couple cool things. And I wanted to start with this, and I kind of feel like I have this tendency to start with a disclaimer, but this one is really important. When we're talking about Christian behavior, there's going to be a tendency, because there always is in human beings, to basically say, all right, these are the boxes that I have to check. And I want to just pause and say, hey, let's let go of that attitude, because there's something deeper that we want to explore here. One of the most profound things I've ever heard was a short snippet written by a guy named George MacDonald, who C.S. Lewis adored. He's a Scottish guy. He was a pastor and a little bit of a theologian. And he said this phrase, and it stuck with me forever. Said, God is easy to please, but he's hard to satisfy. And if you want if you want to really understand what the Christian walk is like, I think that quote is central to it. The illustration he gives is this. He says, what dad wouldn't be ecstatic to see his son take his first steps as a baby? But what dad would ever be content with anything less than the full gait of a man walking? And that's how I view us in terms of Christian behavior. The goal of Christianity was never to follow some rules. It was transformation, and that's transformation of the heart, not external behavior. So with all of that, like with all the stuff that we're going to talk about here, I just want us to keep in mind that God is easy to please. He's happy with the first beginning steps in all of these areas, but he's hard to satisfy. He loves you too much to leave you where you are, and his goal is to transform you into the person you were always made to be. So with that said, let's get into sex. I'm joking. First, we'll get into the 3 parts of morality. Do this for me. Open up. I'm going to try and do this one-handed, which is going to be tough for me. But hey, I'm growing all kinds of ways in this quarantine, so how about you? All right, one-handed Mike is going to read from page 72. This is in the chapter 3 Parts of Morality. Lewis starts like this. Morality seems to be concerned with 3 things. Firstly, with fair play and harmony between individuals. Secondly, with what might be called tidying up or harmonizing the things inside each individual. Thirdly, with the general purpose of human life as a whole, what a man was made for. So in the very beginning, C.S. sets up this thing. He goes, before I even talk about the specific types of morality, I want to just couch morality in these three central ideas. That morality is 1, social. How do I interact with you? That morality is 2, individual. What is morality like with me? And that 3, it's also communicative. So we're headed in a direction as a people. And those are the 3 parts of morality. He gives an illustration that you'll love, and if you remember one thing from the night, you can definitely take this illustration to the bank. He says morality is like a fleet of ships. You have individual ships and how they relate to each other. You have the fleet itself and the mission that they're on. And so there's an interesting thing that people say a lot of times in society. They basically will say something like, well, listen, I'm not hurting anybody. If I'm not hurting anybody, it's not wrong, because this is just me as an individual. I make my own choices. And there are certain things that you really can believe that you do on your own that don't affect anybody else. And what C.S. is trying to prove in this chapter is that's kind of just wrong. The reason he gives the ship's analogy is because if a ship isn't properly cared for, if the captain doesn't know what he's doing, if the equipment is bad, what's going to happen is eventually you're going to bump into another ship. And that's how we actually affect each other. I don't even need to tell you or give you examples of the ways that we actually, through some of our own moral failings on an individual level, end up affecting a lot of people, our families, our friends, relationships. And so the idea is it's not necessarily, you as an individual are not a person on an island. You have a great effect on everybody else. But he also says the overall trajectory of where the fleet is heading. Could you imagine if there was a fleet of ships, but they didn't know where they were going, or even worse, everybody made up their own idea of where they were going? What would happen is everybody would run into each other. And so when he talks about morality, he says, we have to have a social morality. How do we interact? But the individual has to be part of that too, and we have to have a sense that we're going somewhere together or we're never going to be on the same page. And all kind of brokenness is created in the world because of our lack of being on the same page. I think about this, when I talk to people about morality today, I basically say there's 2 ways to look at morality. There's one way is the modern way that we tend to look at it in our world today, which is top down. And then there's the Christian way, which is bottom up. So what does top down mean? Top down means that we believe that social systems should define what the individual does. And so we have certain rules in our social system, and as long as you adhere to that, fine. Whatever you do in the sanctity of your own home or whatever you think inside of your head, that's fine. Just don't bring it into the social sphere where we have rules. Christianity says the reverse. The individual has to live a life according to God's plan, and the byproduct of that is a social system where justice, equality, fairness, all the things that we're looking for are the result. So here's a way that, just to give you an example of how that breaks down, think about something like the Me Too movement. I would say, for me, the most surprising thing of the Me Too movement was that it was surprising. And what I mean by that was everybody was shocked when these stories came out about executives abusing power, that people had buzzers that locked their doors in their rooms, and all of that stuff. And I remember just thinking, why is everybody absolutely shocked that people, like when I look at our culture and I see rampant pornography, that there's a hookup culture, that you have, a prostitute available in an app, like all of that. Why did anybody think that none of that would have bled into the professional space? Did we just think, well, we made the rules here, so that's fine, and whatever you do on an individual level is whatever? The Christian way would basically say, well, listen, because on an individual level, we believe not in random hookup culture, that you shouldn't view pornography, go down the list. Because of that, the byproduct is a social system that actually makes sense and people are treated fairly and not put it, not sexually assault it, to basically put it succinctly. So that's the difference. Morality that's either top down, that's the modern way, or bottom up, the Christian way. God starts with you, and society is bettered as a byproduct of that. So that's his analogy to kind of get things going. And then he goes, okay, so what does Christian morality actually look like? Now, there's probably 6 or 7 chapters in this section. It's way too much to go over in the next, 20 minutes. And so the smartest way I think to go through it is to basically go through C.S. Lewis's virtues that he's named. Now, follow me through this because I know that I'm going to be confusing and I probably can't help it, but I want to take 3 of his virtues and basically do the opposite, what we would call the heavy kind of sins that we know. And then I want to take 3 other virtues and focus on the virtues themselves. The 3 sins that I want to focus on are basically sex, money, and power, or sex, money, and pride. And you're familiar with these: lust of the flesh, lust of the eyes, and the pride of life. These are 3 central things that Christians know that they've got to beat. And so when we look at these, there was virtues as you walked through these couple chapters. But we're going to take the reverse of them. We're going to focus on the sins because I feel like they're a little bit more palatable. Like in our culture, we understand these more than the virtues. The virtues tend to have some old names that we don't use anymore. I don't know when the last time you said temperance was, but I haven't used that in a long time. So we're going to try and focus on these 3 sins to begin with. What does Christianity say about these things called sins in a world that doesn't even believe sin is a thing anymore? So I'm going to open up to the first one, which is sex. And so if you have your book, open up to page 95 with me. And we're going to read a little bit about sex. He starts off by saying this: chastity, I'm on page 95. Chastity is the most unpopular of the Christian virtues. There is no getting away from it. The Christian rule is either marriage with complete faithfulness to your partner or else total abstinence. Now, this is so difficult and so contrary to our instincts that obviously either Christianity is wrong or our sexual instinct, as it now is, has gone wrong. One or the other. Of course, being a Christian, I think it's the instinct which has gone wrong. So he paints a really cool picture in here about the difference between, the fundamental problem in our sexuality. We know there's a strong sexual desire. Sex seems to be very rampant in our culture. What's the problem here? Is it that Christians have too high of a moral standard, or is there something with the instinct gone wrong? I like that he starts and he basically says, hey, listen, this is the most unpopular of all the virtues. And when I read it, I thought actually there was, I was in Guatemala a couple weeks before COVID happened, and we were on the bus, and there was couples that were telling their story of how they met. And when I was reading this, I was laughing because I remember this one couple. They were saying that they met. They were kind of like walking through their story of meeting and how they first started dating or whatever. And I'm in the back of the bus just reading a book or something. And so I just to kind of spice things up was like, so how did you guys maintain appropriate sexual boundaries when you started dating? And they both just cracked up laughing, and the whole bus started laughing. And I probably should have never said it, but it's funny because his first reaction was, he said, well, I wasn't a Christian back then, thank God. And I think that is the truth about it, about everything related to chastity. Like Augustine said, he said when he was younger, he would pray, God, grant me chastity, but not yet. And it's just that there's such a strong desire here that's hard to get away from. And C.S. Lewis says, okay, the desire is strong. So what do we make of that? Is Christianity off, or is the instinct gone wrong? And so it's an interesting question. Here's what he says that I think sheds a lot of light on this. Turn the page and go to 96. So he says, think about this. You can get a large audience together for a striptease act, that is, to watch a girl undress on stage. Now suppose you came to a country where you could fill a theater by simply bringing a covered plate onto the stage and then slowly lifting the cover, so as to let everyone see, just before the lights went out, that it contained a mutton chop or a bit of bacon. Would you not think that in that country something had gone wrong with the appetite for food? And would not anyone who'd grown up in a different world think that there was something equally queer about the state of the sex instinct among us? One critic said that if he found a country in which striptease acts with food were popular, he would conclude that the people of that country were starving. He meant, of course, to imply that such things as striptease acts resulted not from sexual corruption, but from sexual starvation. And the idea is this, and this is the point that C.S. Lewis is trying to make in this chapter and in regards to Christian sexuality. Sex was created for intimacy, and intimacy is the overall goal. In our modern world, we've made it just an instinct like a bodily instinct for the sake of pleasure. And so when you look at that, you have this strange dichotomy, and what you find is that in a culture where pornography is rampant, where there are strip shows and all that type of stuff, what you're finding is not people who have indulged the sexual instinct fully, but what you're finding is people who have repressed the intimacy that they truly desire. And so that's where sex goes wrong. He kind of completes the chapter. I have a highlight here where he talks about this. He says, People often understand what psychology teaches about repressions. It teaches us that repressed sex is dangerous. But repressed is just a technical term. It doesn't mean suppressed in the sense or denied or resisted. A repressed desire or thought is one which has been thrust into our subconscious and can now come before the mind only in a disguised and unrecognizable form. Repressed sexuality does not appear to the patient to be sexuality at all. When an adolescent or an adult is engaged in resisting a conscious desire, he's not dealing with a repression, nor is he in the least danger of creating a repression. On the contrary, those who are seriously attempting chastity are more conscious and soon know a great deal more about their own sexuality than anyone else. It's kind of, you can see the easy metaphor with this with anything that you really, anything that you decide not to indulge yourself in, any of your instincts. The easiest one for most of us is food. The reason I don't run to Chick-fil-A every single day, but I probably will run to tonight after this live stream, is because I know that I would get fat, my body would break down, it's just not good for me every day. And so what I do is I don't indulge in that instinct. I feel the instinct, but I don't indulge. It's not a repression. And so the idea behind our sexuality is it's not repressed sexuality to not have sex with anyone in a hookup culture. It's that the overall goal, God designed sex for intimacy, and that's why sex with one person for life, humans mate for life, is what Christianity teaches. I wanted to just say this before we leave this section, because I think it's really important. There's a story in the Bible about a woman caught in adultery, and I think it's one of the most profound stories in the whole Bible. The woman is caught in the act. The Pharisees bring her in front of Jesus, and they say, "This woman was caught in adultery, and we should stone her. What do you say?" And in one of the most interesting moments in the whole Bible, Jesus stoops down and he starts to write in the sand. And no one knows what he wrote. It's a conundrum. But then he stood up and he said, "He who is without sin cast the first stone." And it says from the oldest to the youngest, they dropped their stones and they left. Maybe because the old ones know how hard it actually is. But then Jesus looks at this woman and he says, "Woman, where are your accusers?" And she looks around and she says, "They're gone." And then he leans in and he says, "Then neither do I accuse you. Go and sin no more." And I love that because, like as Shane Claiborne puts it, there was a person there who was sinless and had a right to throw stones. But the only person with any right to throw a stone has absolutely no desire. And so I know that there's a lot of mistakes and there's a lot of history in this area, and people feel a lot of regret or they feel a lot of shame. And so before we leave, I just wanted to say that interaction with Jesus is the same interaction with all of us. That he looks down at us and he says, "Where are your accusers?" But he does say, "Go and sin no more." And so while this is a tough hurdle, and this is like the most unpopular of all the virtues, the one that we don't really think is possible, I just think with God this is actually possible, and that there's so much fruit at the end of this. I've shared this story at Calvary before. When I was younger, I was just in a weird phase in life, and I was texting this girl, and I was at my house, she was at her house, and then she was like, "You should come over." And I kind of had this feeling like it wasn't going to be a good night. Like it just, I was going to compromise on like a lot of my values, and I pretty much knew that. But I was going to do it anyway. And so I jumped in my car and I closed the door, and the second I closed the door, put my hands on the ignition, and I went to turn it, and I felt about as audible as a voice that God can give. And he said, it's almost like the whole car shook. And he said this, "Everything's permissible. You decide how hard you want your life to be." And I think that's the profound truth behind all of this is how free do you want to be? There's a lot of people that are slaves to their sexuality, and slaves to the sexual culture that we've been given. And so we desire freedom in that, and Christianity is freedom from that. And then intimacy. I forget who it was, John Mark McMillan. He said intimacy is way better than novelty, and our culture you have to take the time to learn that. But that's the I guess sexual journey that Christians are on, and that's what Christians believe about sexuality. Now, if that's sex, let's go to money. What do Christians believe about money? This is couched in the virtue of charity, and I'm going to say let's turn to page 86 to read about money. So I love this. He says, "Charity, giving to the poor, is an essential part of Christian morality. In the frightening parable of the sheep and the goats, it seems to be the point on which everything turns. Some people nowadays say that charity ought to be unnecessary, and instead of giving to the poor, we ought to be producing a society in which there was no poor to give to. They might be quite right in saying that. But if anyone thinks that, as a consequence, you can stop giving in the meantime, then he has parted company with all Christian morality. I do not believe one can settle how much we ought to give. I'm afraid the only safe rule, here's the important part, is to give more than we can spare. In other words, if our expenditure on comforts, luxuries, amusements, etc. is up to the standard common among those amusements, etc., is up to the standard common among those with the same income as our own, we're probably giving away too little. If our charities do not pinch or hamper us, I should say they're too small. This is the money portion of things in Christianity is a tall task, I think, because it requires a ton of faith. And C.S. Lewis kind of nails it. It's like give till it hurts. That's basically the message that Christianity teaches. When you think about what it means to love your neighbor as yourself, it's kind of a hard task because whatever you spend on yourself, you technically should spend on your neighbor. And that's some of what he explores in this chapter. But I think to boil it down to that phrase, give till it hurts, is the important part. Now, here's the thing. I actually don't think for the most part that people are I don't think that, like, in the people that I've bumped into and the people that I've gotten into conversations with about this, I've never really come across somebody who didn't want to give because they were like, I just want to, like, one day own a yacht. I just want to make sure that I can buy that flat screen TV. I haven't really bumped into a lot of people like that. What I have bumped into is a lot of people who don't give out of fear because you're scared if you give too much, there won't be enough for you when it's done. And so what you have is a bunch of people who work till they're 68, 70 years old. They're compiling a 401k that's millions of dollars, and the truth is you'll never have enough. I remember the quote, some people are so poor all they have is money. And you give your whole life to basically just accumulating this wealth because you think that's what's going to make you safe. But the problem is that tie, for some reason, that tie of money and security is unbelievably hard to break. So hard to break that when you read the story of the rich young ruler in the Bible, he actually denies the chance to be Jesus' 13th disciple because he had too much wealth. It says Jesus told him, he said, what do I need to do to inherit eternal life? And Jesus gave him the list. He said, do these things. And he said, Jesus, I've done all of that. I should be good, right? Jesus says, one thing you lack. Go sell everything that you have and give it to me. Now, what was the problem with selling everything? Do you think the rich young ruler was like, well, I just like avocado toast every day? Like, was that the problem? Or was it giving up the safety and security of having total control over his life? And the Bible tells us, it says he went away sad because he had much wealth. And that's the problem. That's the vicious cycle of money, is if we're not giving recklessly, then what happens is we get caught in the cycle of security. I'll give you a story from my own life. I kind of thought that I was a giver, and I always really wanted to be. But I kept running into this problem where I would look at my financials at the end of the year, and I would do my taxes, and I would be like, I pretty much consider myself a generous person, but I don't really know that the numbers actually reflect that. So I decided to do something different, and I gave my money that I would give at the end of the year in the beginning of the year. So I can't even go through all of the ways that God has proven so faithful in that. But one of the ways I'll share with you, I remember, so I only give to a certain amount of charities, 4 or 5. And I have a rule that if I give to a charity, I actually have a couple rules around it. One rule is I need to be able to tell the story of them on an airplane, which you can't even fly anymore. Tell the story of them on an airplane and love what I'm talking about. So that's my first rule. My second rule is I need to be able, if I'm going to give to a charity, I want to be able to give my money to the same place I can give my time. So I had one charity on there that I really wanted to give to. Their story was compelling. I loved the guy who ran it. And I was just like, I don't know what to do. So I gave anyway. And I was like, God, you're going to have to show up and make the time component because I can give the money. I just don't know how to help these people. Literally 2 weeks later, I got a phone call from the guy who runs that organization. And he called me and said, Mike, I've been thinking about this for 10 years. I'd love to invite you to serve on our board. We would love to get your head around some of the stuff that we're doing. Ended up later traveling to another country, seeing the work that they do on the ground, and it was an amazing experience. And it's just funny because when I look back at the end of the year, I was just like, what if I've opted for security instead of generosity? What if I had opted for that? I would have lived half a life. Like, I would consider in my 2019 that to be probably one of my top 3 experiences. And it just wouldn't have happened if I didn't decide up front to just say, God, I believe that this is a requirement from you, that this is what it takes for me to become who I'm supposed to be, so I'm going all in. I went all in January 1st, and God delivered within 2 or 3 weeks. So that's I think, like when C.S. Lewis talks about this idea of give till it hurts, I gave to the extent that it really did hurt, you know? But what I got back from that, not financially, but what I got back from that from a life standpoint, from just becoming who God wants me to be, totally invaluable. That's how Christians think about money. All right. Last one of the sins. Who wants to stay in sins longer? Not me. All right. Last one of the sins. Pride. This is on page 122. I'll turn there real quick. So you'll notice that the chapter has the title, The Great Sin. Pride is the great sin in C.S. Lewis's mind. In fact, he even downplays the sin of sexuality. He says it's really not where the central part of morality lies. And even in generosity, what we do with our money, still not the central part. He focuses on this chapter and he says, this sin, pride, is where it's really at. If you have problems, they usually are related to pride. Listen to what he says here, and this is on page 122. Now, what you want to get clear is that pride is essentially competitive. It's competitive by its very nature. While the other vices are competitive only, so to speak, by accident, pride gets no pleasure out of having something, only out of having more of it than the next man. We say that people are proud of being rich or clever or good-looking, but they're really not. They're proud of being richer or cleverer or better-looking than others. If everyone else became equally rich or clever or good-looking, there would be nothing to be proud about. It's the comparison that makes you proud, the pleasure of being above the rest. Once the element of competition has gone, pride has gone. That's why I say that pride is essentially competitive in a way that the other vices are not. The sexual impulse may drive 2 men into competition if they both want the same girl. But that's only by accident. They could have likely just wanted 2 different girls. But a proud man will take your girl from you, not because he wants her, but to prove to himself that he's a better man than you. Greed may drive men into competition if there's not enough to go around. But the proud man, even when he has more than he can possibly want, will try to get still more just to assert his own power. Nearly all the evils in the world, which people put down to greed or selfishness, are really far more the result of pride. I think this is one of the most profound things in the entire book, to be honest. I remember hearing about a study they did at Princeton, and they asked students, first-year students that came in an economics class, they said, would you rather, they're playing our would you rather game, would you rather that you make $50,000 a year, but you can afford to buy absolutely everything, would you rather you make $200,000 a year? And with that $200,000 a year, you can buy everything you want. Everything else, like the prices of everything are fixed and normal. So you can go have your vacations in Bali. You can send your kids to private school. You can do whatever you want. But everybody else in the world makes $200,000 too. Or would you rather you make $50,000 a year? Prices remain fixed. No vacations in Bali. Can't send your kids to private school. None of that. But everybody else in the world makes $25,000. And without fail, every time they did that, every time the students came in, the majority of the students picked, I would rather make $50,000 a year as long as I could make twice as much as everybody else. And the idea there is that money is actually just a metric for what's my intelligence level? How successful am I? How likable am I, right? So the idea of selfishness, a lot of people aren't inherently selfish. It's that their pride compels them to be better than the next guy, so they're going to take as much as they can. This is what C.S. Lewis is talking about in this chapter. I think that this is super interesting because what you'll see is that a lot of the things that we mistake for sins are actually all in some way connected to pride. So C.S. Lewis goes through some of them here. One of the things that I think, let me thumb to Um, one of the ways that we can combat pride is through the virtue of humility, which he talks about towards the end of the chapter. And I just want to read this one part and then talk about it. This is on page 128. He says, "Do not imagine that if you meet a really humble man, he will be what most people call humble nowadays. He will not be a sort of greasy, smarmy person who's always telling you that of course he's a nobody. Probably all you will think about him is that he seemed a cheerful, intelligent chap who took a real interest in what you said to him. If you dislike him, it will be because you feel a little envious of anyone who seems to enjoy life so easily. He will not be thinking about humility. He will not be thinking of himself at all." I think this is the real crux of the lifelong journey of the Christian. How do I not think of myself at all? You'll remember that this is called the great sin because it's the sin in the beginning. The serpent promised to Eve, your eyes will be open and you can be like God. Equal footing, that's all we long for, right? But things in their right place, you and I in our right place is putting each other first. Love your neighbor as yourself. Can you actually love the person next to you with the same love that you love yourself? Super interesting thing that he talks about here where he says, he talks about our sin and he says, can you actually hate the sin but still love the sinner? And he goes, yeah, you can, because you do it to yourself. You kind of hate the things that you do, and at the same time, you love yourself. Can we think of people in the same light? Can we not reduce people to the things they do, but can we see into them and see who the person that they are, what God's made them to be, and actually put that person first? Can we actually truly love our neighbor as ourselves? I think this story is very interesting. This idea is very evident in the story of Nicodemus in the Bible. So I've always been intrigued by Nicodemus. He came to Jesus at night. He was the teacher in Israel. He was probably like he was running the live stream and was just like the dude over and over and over again. And he went to Jesus because Jesus was performing all kinds of miracles, but he went at night because he didn't want anybody to see what was going on. He was like, I know that there's some truth here. I just can't let anybody know that I'm searching for it. How could he? He's the teacher in Israel. So he has a conversation with Jesus, and it's super confusing, and Jesus tells him, you got to be born again, and he's like, I don't get this. And then you never hear of him again, except when Jesus dies. And there's two people that come and ask for the body, and one of those is Nicodemus. And so what you see is whatever's happened in the past, 2 or 3 years since he talked to Jesus, there's been a trajectory change where all of a sudden the guy who came at night doesn't care anymore what people think about him. He's found the truth, and now he wants to bury the person who embodied the truth. And so I think that's kind of the journey for us. The journey for us is basically we're born just craving attention, craving belonging, just longing for people to say, look at me, look at me, look at me. And the journey of a believer is this life towards less and less and less of me, more of you, more of him. And I would love for the story of my life to be that at first I came to Jesus at night, but then in broad daylight, I was basically doing anything I could for him. Those are the three sins. And C.S. Lewis also discusses. Well, let me take a break here. You guys are chatting up a storm. So let me just say, hey, any questions if you have them now? Let's talk through some of those questions. And then I'm also going to address any questions that have come up since I've been on. So give me a little bit of time. All right, no one can hear me. That's good. All right. Barbara Grace, what's up? Hello? That wasn't hell. That was hello? All right. Laugh out loud. All right, it looks like it's just a bunch of people talking about their Enneagram, which is fine with me. All right, Barb G. If God made us all in his image and likeness, how could we ever have hatred for another person? No judgments, just love. Well, I mean, that's an interesting question. The idea behind all of this is that it's, what C.S. Lewis talked about in the first book is that this is a world where something's gone wrong, And Christians do believe that good and evil are in contention with each other. Now, what is evil? That's a huge, broad question, but we know that one of the fundamental aspects of it is anything opposed to the will of God. Because love is a choice, and love demands a choice, we know that we have the choice to go the opposite direction. So can anybody hate someone? Yeah, they absolutely can, because it's my will be done and not God's will be done. And so I think that's a broader conversation for sure. But yeah, that's the answer to that question. Any more questions? I'm going to keep rolling. I know like not everybody drops questions in these chats, and most of you are probably just chilling on your couch and probably too lazy to drop a question, and you'll just text me later. Shout out to Carini in Brazil, who asked me a ton of questions. Steph O'Berty, probably tuned in right now. Not Steph, Steph Kolka. Sorry, she got married. Shout out to Jess in Australia. Oh, there's another question. Oh my gosh, how do you work against pride as the Enneagram 3? I'll tell you what, C.S. Lewis says some amazing stuff, but I'll just give you my little tips and tricks that I've done in my own life. And I'm dead serious about this because I think honestly, like pride's a killer, and it will literally eat you alive, especially when you get a little bit of success. So my whole life's journey is basically, let me find the bottom of something. I don't want to elevate myself. I don't want to be higher than anybody else. So what can I do? And one of the easiest things to do, one of the most profound things that I've found to be amazing, is wake up in the morning and just pray for other people. Because, like C.S. Lewis said, humility isn't thinking less of yourself. It's not thinking of yourself at all. And I've just found when I pray for people, when I get into their court, when I like engage mentally with someone else's pain, with someone else's problems, with someone else's dreams, when I'm doing that, I'm just not thinking of myself. And what starts to happen is not only do I drift from all my existential messiness or whatever, but I start to move in the sphere where it's like, I actually just don't consider my own dreams, my own problems that big of a deal. And God meets me in that. So I would say being an Enneagram 3, praying for people is a fundamental thing that I just have to do in my life. I just have to. So I journal those prayers out. I write letters to people just to encourage them. I just get as people focused as I can, because left to myself, I will literally just be me all the time. Chuck Summers, Mike, can you address all Eastern religions are self-centered or Christianity is Christ-centered? That was last week, Chuck, but I'll tell you what. I don't know. To be honest, I haven't explored like a ton of. I haven't explored religions, and I said this in the disclaimer in the first class that we took. I haven't explored religions or been have friends who are other religions to the degree that I feel comfortable talking about things like Buddhism, Hinduism, Islam. I'm just not. And so the way that I think, like if someone came to me and said, well, all other religions are self-centered, Christianity is Christ-centered. I can see where you're coming with that, and then at the same time, I just don't feel like an expert to talk on it. I will say this: Christianity is Christ-centered. That's the one thing that I know because I can talk about, and I think that's one of the things that has drawn me to Christianity. I've never done a good job when I've stepped into the little spaces that I have in other religions on things that are what I would call self-centered, works-driven, focused on mindfulness, meditation, all that type of stuff. Like those things, I don't tend to do very well going into those spaces. Where I do go very well, where I do get things right, and where I really feel like ultimately fulfilled, is just serving other people, focusing on other people's hopes, dreams, or longings, all that type of stuff, and being there for people in their pain. Like those things have tended to be things that just made me come alive. But I will say those things are also deeply connected to the three things that we just talked about: money, sex, and power. What are you doing with those things? Because I think that like I said, the question always becomes this in terms of like sin. How free do you want to be? Paul said it's for freedom that we've been set free. It's for freedom that we've been set free. Like the idea of being set free is now that you're free, you can actually live like a free person. You don't have to be a slave to these things. To be a slave to your sexuality, it creates the smallest life you can possibly imagine. To be a slave to money, when you're constantly obsessing about the security and when will you have enough and how you can keep yourself from like this happening or looking like a fool, those things are going to become things that will ultimately just cripple. You're going to live a small life where you've always got to make sure that you always feel like the walls are caving in. And then what about pride? Like to live that life where you always have to maintain the image of perfection and know inside that you're not, but you're going to constantly have to be stepping on people to get where you need to go. It's not the life I want to live. Interesting thing, people always say this: breakthrough in your Christian walk most of the time comes from lowering yourself in some way. Confession's one of the Confession is one of the easiest ways to do that. Confession is this process where you basically say, hey, listen, I'm not as cool as you think I am. Not as perfect as you think I am. I'm just not as good as you think I am. And that's a scary thing because there's a subconscious thought, once people find out who I am, everybody's going to leave me. The reverse is actually true, and that's what you find in the Christian faith. Once everybody finds out who you really are, they want to stay because that's what intimacy looks like. Pride is the loneliest life that you can live. All right. Anybody else? No. Then we're moving on. We're going to get into virtues. By the way, time check. We've basically got 10 minutes left. I'm going to talk about the virtues. You guys can ask more questions, and then you can get back to eating peanut butter, chocolate chip cookies, and chocolate chip pancakes, or, protein shakes and healthy stuff, or whatever you all got. I'm not going to take much more of your time, but it would be crazy to leave this section without talking about the virtues since we talked about the sins. I don't think we have enough time to go into love, into all three of these. There's love, hope, and faith. Those are the three theological virtues. They're tied to belief, right? So just to give like a general overview, love is tied to charity, that virtue of charity. But love revolves around this idea, especially of loving your neighbor and forgiving your neighbor. Forgiving your neighbor because you've been forgiven. That's all I'll say about that. Hope. You can't live the Christian life without a hope for a future. And that future is not the future that you get in this life. That is an ultimate future where you actually get to live eternity with God. I think I'll address this very briefly, but the idea is that if you're living the Christian life hoping that it's going to benefit you in the temporary, it's just never going to satisfy. You were made to ultimately live life completely with God, and that's only possible on the other side of heaven. Here's the cool thing. The best life that you can live is always lived knowing that there's a life beyond this. And so when you see certain people running around basically scratching and clawing for anything that they can get out of this life, it's just it's one of those things. It's like they're just not free. But when you can let go and realize, you know what, everything I'm trying to accomplish in life, all my hopes and dreams, everything that's like tied up in me, all of my existentialness, I'm never really going to get fully there in this life. But the promise of what's coming next is the ultimate fruition of all of those things. That's what actually makes you enjoy this life. I mean, who can enjoy an hourglass that's running out of time? But when you realize that the game has been totally rigged and there is no hourglass and that you're actually going to live forever and that forever starts right now, it just opens up all the horizons of life. So that's hope. What I wanted to talk about was faith, because I think faith is something that's kind of a little bit neglected. People don't really see it anymore as a virtue, but faith is a virtue. So for the most part, people look at faith and they say, okay, faith is just whether you believe something or not, right? So if I have faith that this chair is going to support me, I sit on it. And that's true, but C.S. Lewis is talking about more than that in this chapter. He's saying faith is actually a virtue. It's kind of a muscle that you exercise. What does he mean by that? Well, faith is not necessarily a one-time act. So I'm sure at some point, if you're a believer and you're watching this, then you said, you know what, I really believe all of this stuff. And I guess everything was hunky-dory for you from then on? Like it just kind of, you never had a problem? No, of course not. The way that it actually progressed is 2 weeks later, you got into some type of confrontation, whether it was at work or work. What C.S. Lewis talks about is this virtue, faith, is the idea that we push beyond those external circumstances that push against us through exercising the muscle, the virtue of faith. We have faith to believe even when our emotions come into conflict that what we believed when we weren't emotional is actually still true. I mean, this happens all the time. So I'll give you, for instance, I'm watching this Michael Jordan documentary, which I think everybody else is watching too. And you watch Michael Jordan, you're like, gosh, like this, the best basketball player that the world has ever produced. This guy worked so hard to get where he was. And it's super inspiring. And I fall asleep every Sunday night and I just think, I'm doing it. I'm becoming the MJ of my own sphere. Like, I'm going for it. And I wake up the next day, and what happens? Well, it's 6 a.m. I guess what MJ was doing was he was going to the gym, pumping iron, riding a bike, whatever. And it's 6 a.m., and my emotions say, man, I didn't get a lot of sleep last night. I should sleep in. And so I do. And so I'm not MJ. And that's kind of like the way that it seems to work. And so the Christian life is no different. You've made a decision. You know what your ideal is. You know what you're shooting for, and you know what you believe. But when the emotions of life come and push up against you, what do? You have to have the faith when stuff hits you that actually transcends the circumstances that you're in. So that plays itself out in all kinds of instances. But I say this for like a pretty particular reason, and that's this. Let me read from page 149. There's this constant interplay with the idea of faith. Is it, how do I hold to this Christian behavior? Is it that I have faith that God has done what he's done for me, and so I can just rest in that? Or do I have to wake up and do? It's like this idea between faith and works is what we call it. And faith is really interesting because you have to, these two things are inextricably tied together. Somehow faith and works both connect. And so C.S. Lewis raises the question: if Christian behavior becomes hard, what can we muster the faith to do it anyway because we believe that it's true? And so this faith and work combo to him seemed pretty simple. And I think he says it best on page 149. He says, the Bible seems to really clinch the matter when it puts the two things together into one amazing sentence. The first half is, work out your own salvation with fear and trembling. That would be the works element of thing, which looks as if everything depended on us and our good actions. But the second half goes on, for it is God who works in you, which looks as if God did everything and we did nothing. I'm afraid this is the sort of thing we come up against in Christianity. And I'm puzzled, but not surprised. The reason he's not surprised is that paradox is one of the things that's central to the Christian faith and central to us living a fulfilling life. This idea that faith and works go together. We have works, and we have works because we believe in something that we've walked through the process of our belief, and now our actions actually live out those beliefs. Every now and then there's going to be things that push up against those. It's going to say, well, doing this action is going to compromise you. Doing this action is going to make you look bad. Doing this action means you have to forego that pleasure. And every time that happens, we're going to basically lose it and say, all right, is this really true? Is what I believed in the beginning really true? And what C.S. Lewis is saying is that's when faith comes in. The faith not to just believe at first, but to continue to believe as things push up against us. So a lot of people talk to me about faith and works and, the interplay between them. And Mike, how does that work? And so one of the things that I've always loved is I think that at the core of it, most people are asking the question, how do I know I have faith? How do I know that works really gets me anywhere? And how do I know that any of this is good in the end? And I always point people to what's your fruit. And fruit is a funny thing because it's a very biblical term, super misunderstood today. I've never in my life planted a garden nor tended a tree. I went apple picking like one time 3 years ago, and that's about my extent of knowledge when it comes to fruit. But the Bible uses the metaphor of fruit tons of times. And I love the way Tim Keller says this. He says, the interesting thing about fruit is that growth is slow, but it's inevitable. And so when you look at your life, when you look at how you respond to these certain behaviors, how you act in the moment, how you exercise your faith muscle when things get hard, it's so interesting because you'll see over the course and the trajectory of your life fruit. I see it in my life and I see it in the life of the people around me. You see all kinds of things where it's like, wow, like people will come up to you eventually and say, man, you just talk differently than you used to. Man, I just feel so encouraged when I'm around you. Man, you tend to pull these people together that nobody could. Man, look at, what if you could look at your tax statements 10 years from now and be like, oh my gosh, organizations literally spun up and relied on me giving, and I've changed so many communities because of what I was able to give. Like, the fruit payoff of living the right behavior is amazing. The problem is it's slow. And so do we have the faith to know, like Paul says, that he who began a good work in us will be faithful to complete that work? But it's inevitable. Over time, you'll be able to look at your life and see and trace the trajectory. This is when I started changing things, and this is the result of that. It's one of the most fulfilling things you could ever walk in. I love the way that C.S. Lewis ends this chapter, which is the end of the book, the section of the book as well. He says, I think all Christians would agree with me if I said that though Christianity seems at first to be all about morality, all about duties and rules and guilt and virtue. Let it lead you on out of all of that into something beyond. One has a glimpse of a country where they don't talk of such things, except perhaps as a joke. Everyone there is filled full with what we should call goodness, as a mirror is filled with light. But they do not call it goodness. In fact, they don't call it anything. They are not thinking of it. They are too busy looking at the source from which it comes. But this is near the stage where the road passes over the rim of the world. No one's eyes can see very far beyond that. Lots of people's eyes can see further than mine. When I was about a year ago, I came across a poem by the old poet Rumi, and it's just a quick poem, and it says, "Out beyond all ideas of right doing and wrong doing, there's a field. I'll meet you there." And I remember just reading it casually and then thinking about it as I was on my bike ride later, and I was like, out beyond all ideas of right doing and wrong doing, there's a field. I'll meet you there. And isn't the trajectory of the Christian life, isn't the trajectory of this Christian faith that we walk in, that these ideas of right and wrong slowly disappear as our lives are transformed? That the field that God actually longs to meet us in is not the field of tick-tack, what happened here, did you do the right thing or whatever, but a heart transformation where you actually where goodness is just part of who you are, where you walk in truth and faithfulness and justice because you couldn't dream of anything else. Out beyond all ideas of right doing and wrong doing, there's a field. I'll meet you there. When we look at morality and like what C.S. Lewis is walking us through here, obviously there are just some rules that we play by as Christians. But I think we'd be amiss if we acted like the Christian faith was about anything like rules. In fact, of all the religions, it's the least about rules. It's the most about transformation of the heart. It's interesting to think about that when Jesus came, he kind of flipped the law on its head. And he said, if you've lusted after a woman in your heart, you've committed adultery. I would have been like, what? Are you kidding? I thought I had all my ducks in a row. I've never committed adultery, but now you've just upped the stakes. And he was like, yeah, obviously. And he went through line by line, every single line of the law, and said, if you think about these things, if you meditate on any of these things, you've committed the thing itself, because it's not about your external behavior. It's about your internal transformation. But one day, through the process of following these guidelines, we get to a field where beyond ideas of right doing and wrong doing, we meet God for exactly who we were supposed to be and see him for exactly who he is. And that's the goal of Christian behavior. So to make a long story short, worked our way through the very beginnings of belief. Is there a God? Okay, if there are all religions the same, or is one of them different? If Christianity is different, how do we actually act and live our lives? And the answer is not by doing things. Yes, by following certain behaviors, but not for the sake of behaviors, but for total transformation of the heart to eventually meet God in the field out beyond all ideas of behaviors. And that's it. So I'm going to give you guys like a 2-minute break. And we'll kind of reconvene and we'll go through a Q&A for whoever wants to hang out. And I'll take as long as you want. So it's just me and Taylor tonight. So we're chilling here and we've got all night and we're ready to answer as many questions as you have. Oh yeah, that's true. Pastor Bob's here too. He's way in the back in one of the seats. But yeah, we'll give you guys 2 minutes. I'll come back and answer any questions that you might have had from this section. Thank y'all. I'll start rolling with, it looks like we had 2 questions from Instagram today. If you guys don't know, I actually post a little thing on Instagram, on CCdelco's Instagram, and And you guys can ask questions there ahead of time. So what we've got 2 questions from Instagram right off the bat. All right, people are asking me to do the music, so I'm just going to say do 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 da da na 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 na. All right. Gosh, I have to look at myself in here. You guys can't even see. I have to look at myself. Is it trying to believe God? Ah, that's interesting. I don't know. Let me look through my faith chapter real quick to see if I can have an easy answer for that. If I highlighted anything, and I don't know that I did. I don't think I highlighted anything where I can draw out like, okay, C.S. Lewis said this. But one of the things that I'll say is the thing I said in the beginning. Now, George MacDonald's interesting. He's a fantasy writer who was also a pastor. And C.S. Lewis basically was like, I never knew what good fantasy was until I read George MacDonald. And he's the one who said, God's easy to please but hard to satisfy. I would say this. There are areas in our life where we just can't seem to overcome certain things, and we don't have the faith that God will actually be faithful in them. In my own personal life, what I've seen is exercising the faith muscle in areas that I can control is huge. So does C.S. Lewis talk about it? I don't know, but I will say just some practical wisdom from a person who's a couple years into this whole thing. Like have faith for what you can have faith for. What do you got in you? You know, God's going to take that. He's easy to please. God's going to take that and multiply it. So I think that like that's the important thing is to make sure you exercise the faith muscle. And what you'll see in the end is that as that goes slowly, you'll see that muscle grows and grows. And then for big things in life, you'll be turning to God in faith for him to deliver on those things. That's what I would say to that. What else do we got? All right. What do you say to people who believe in God but don't appear to demonstrate faith? Yeah. So I love the analogy that C.S. Lewis gave in here, or the picture that C.S. Lewis gave in the faith chapter, where he talks about faith and works, and he says it's a weird question to ask people who. Let me make sure I have the question right. Believe in God but don't appear to demonstrate faith. So here's what's interesting about it. He uses this scissors analogy, right? And he says people talk about faith and works as if they're 2 different things, but they're not. They're basically doing the same exact job, just like a scissors does. So it'd be like asking which blade on the scissors is faith and which is works. Doesn't matter. I don't care which blade is which on my scissors. I need them both to actually cut something. And so with that word picture, it's so helpful because it's like, yeah, what Paul says, my faith without works is dead. But obviously what flows out of faith is something like works. So when people say that they have faith and that they do believe in God, but they never exercise that, the reality is this. We've talked about this through the whole process of this class. God loves you just as you are, but he loves you too much to keep you there, which means that you're on a faith journey. And that faith journey is not from comfort to comfort. It's from something comfortable to something hard. And the way that you actually know that you're walking something out in faith is if you're actually moving in the direction of resistance. And so what I would say to somebody who believes in God but doesn't walk something out in faith is, I don't really know that you believe in God. And that would be my answer to that. All right. Rebecca, what's up, Rebecca Pierre? Do you have any advice for college students who have classes that challenge their faith? How can they work their faith muscle in situations like that? That's actually a really good question. So if I was in college right now, first of all, I would just have some grace for myself because, so that's you, Rebecca. I would definitely have grace for that unless you're asking for a friend. I would have grace for yourself because one of the things that that's tough about the faith muscle is like what we said earlier about fruit. Growth is slow but inevitable. And here's the important part. Take in as much information as you want and press against all the things that you think you need to press against. I would just not abandon God in the middle of all of that. Faith can be as little as just, God, I don't believe anything except that you're real. And I think that he can work with that. You just work with what you got. And the thing I love about that is people came with almost nothing to Jesus sometimes. When you think about the story of Zacchaeus, I mean, this is a guy who was hiding in a tree. And all he wanted was just to see Jesus when he passed by. Didn't think he could change his life. Didn't think that he had any effect on his life. Just want to hide in a tree. Everybody's been talking. This guy's been hitting all the headlines. I just want to see who this is. Jesus comes, calls him out, and says, hey, I want to come to your house today. By the end of the night, total life transformation. I just believe that if you're even the smallest bit open to what God wants to do in your life, that he will be faithful in that. The other thing is pray. You know, one of the pastors that I love says this all the time. Just pray what you got, right? Just pray what you got. If you just basically say, hey, Lord, I believe, help my unbelief, that's all you got. God, I don't think that you're going to come through in this situation, so I'm going to stay in it. Great. Just be honest about that. Pray what you got. See if God's faithful and delivers. That's a great way to live life, because here's the thing about God. He truly, truly delivers. What else we got? Do the music. All right. Lenig, this is James Newsom. Can you explain about being in your heart? I'm going to go out on a limb, James, and say that you are wondering when people say Jesus is in your heart. And I don't know if I have a super profound answer for that. I think this. When someone says their heart, they just mean their soul. Even when we have like sappy like love letters we write to each other or whatever, it's like, you're in my heart. It just means you're deeply connected to my soul. And I think that our souls were designed and built to be in communion with God. And so when someone says Jesus comes into your heart, or that Jesus is in my heart, or I love Jesus, you're talking about a soul mingling between you as spirit and God. And that's all I think it really means. I don't think there's any profound transaction that occurs where one day Jesus literally enters into your heart. I don't think there's any kind of I don't think there's anything literal or even metaphorical about that. I just think it's the way that we express that our desires have shifted, that we've made space in our soul to connect with God again, and so we have. What else we got? Do you think man possessed the idea of morality before the fall? Wow, that's actually a really good question. Linda, thanks for asking that question. Do I think that man possessed morality before the fall? I think that there's, I don't want to get into territory I don't know much about. So I guess I'll just, quick disclaimer, this could be right or wrong and I have absolutely no idea. I don't know if they had a sense of morality in total right and wrong, because it does say that their eyes were opened. And I don't know what that means exactly, but I do know that their eyes were opened in some way. What were their eyes open to? Maybe they could discern more wrong and right. But I will say my little skull-sized theology on this is that everything goes back to that idea of the knowledge of good and evil. I think that we were presented in the very beginning with the choice, do we love God, do we submit, or do we go the opposite direction? But what happens with the tree of knowledge of good and evil is basically your eyes are open to the possibilities that morality creates. Now, before that sounds too weird and out there and complex, let me just explain. I don't know that before the fall we actually knew the possibilities that where we could go right or wrong in certain dimensions. What I do know is this: the world we live in today, we don't seem to be able to navigate morality extremely well. Most of us don't know how to actually discern good from evil when we get down to like the brass tacks of it. So I think that the overall, like this prideful, self-centered idea that we have that one day we'll be able to, I mean, think about what he said. Your eyes will be open and you'll be like God. What does that mean? I think that if you look at everything that we're trying to do, put together an amazing society where everybody does the right thing, treats each other fairly, whatever, and we can't figure it out. It all revolves around this idea of the knowledge of good and evil. We can't figure out what's right and what's wrong. I remember when pornography, when it got to the Supreme Court and they were talking about, should pornography be legal online? Is there a way to make it illegal? And I remember one of the Supreme Court judges wrote something so interesting. He said, the problem with legislating pornography is I don't know how to define it. I only know it when I see it. And what he meant is it's kind of feels like it's subjective to me, but I do know that there is something, because the second I see it and the second I get some type of stimulation out of it, I know exactly what it is. We are presented as human beings with this knowledge of good and evil, but we actually don't know how to say this is right, this is wrong. in how we create like our social systems and all of that. And so I think that's the unattainable thing that we can never really get to. Only with literal relational life with God and through, in my own opinion, just being informed by the Holy Spirit, do you actually get to a place where you can know what is best. But ultimately, God knows what is right. And we were designed to live like that. And so I don't know how to discern right and wrong without being intimately connected to God. My best answer, and I don't think that was that good. What else we got? Kay Sarah says, oh, that's Kim. What's up, Kim? You love George McDonald. Lisa and Nino, back for more action. I love your questions, Lisa. I also love your masks. I wear them every day. Big fan. Lisa, how do you encourage someone who says that they want to believe and have been knocking on the door for many years and have still not had an answer? I mean, that's a super important question. I have people like that in my life. And I've also, I don't say this, I've been that person in my life. When I was growing up, when I was younger, I was like, I kind of vaguely believe this is true, but definitely not transformationally true. And I'm not willing to really give anything up to live like that, especially if I don't believe. And so I didn't. And I think that's like obviously a deep question, because we all have people who have been in that space and who long for that. And so I would just, for some reason I keep thinking of this story that Martin Luther said, where a woman came up to him and she said, I really just don't believe that Christianity is true. And he said, well, why? And she goes, because I don't end up like doing the things that Christianity has called me to do. And he was like, okay, have you tried? And she goes, no, I don't really try because I don't believe. And it was kind of this like, you can talk like that forever, but there's a scripture in the Bible where Jesus says, it's one of the most famous. He says, then they shall know the truth, and the truth shall set you free. And he says those words, and everybody's like, oh, I just long to be free. The truth will set me free. I long to be free. The interesting thing is what he says before that. I don't have the exact scripture. I'm so bad with references. But he said, those who do what I say, they shall know the truth, and then the truth shall set you free. And there's a weird thing about Christianity where a lot of times it's not necessarily intellectual belief or even emotional belief. Sometimes you just actually walk out this life. Like I've told people, even if it might feel weird, have you tried getting on your knees near your bed and just praying? Have you tried to live this lifestyle of generosity? Have you tried those types of things? Because if it's really worth looking into, I think it's worth trying behaviorally. And that's kind of an interesting, like that verse has always just sent my head spinning. Those who do what I say, then they'll know the truth. You do first, you know the truth second, you're free last. Just my 2 cents on that. All right, Chris Bates. What's up, Chris? I hope you're out of LA at this point. So if our faith is truly the pearl of great price, what can we do to actively nourish this invaluable treasure? That's a good question. And I kind of think it's, right along the lines of what C.S. Lewis closed that chapter out with. Faith is, let me try and get to a section. Give me a second. I'm going to burn through this book real quick. I don't know if you guys read this. This is on page 132, and it's in charity. Charity is the virtue that we call love today. And he was talking about C.S. Lewis talking about loving people, loving your neighbor as yourself. And this always strikes me. He says, good and evil both increase at compound interest. That's why the little decisions you and I make every day are of such infinite importance. The smallest good act today is the capture of a strategic point from which a few months later you may be able to go on to victories you never dreamed of. An apparently trivial indulgence in lust or anger today is the loss of a ridge or a railway line or a bridgehead from which the enemy may launch an attack otherwise impossible. Think about that sentence. Good and evil increase at compound interest. You want to talk about something really profound. C.S. Lewis walks through a crazy thing where he talks about the things we do in this life matter so much because everything increases at compound interest. And if we're going to live for eternity, what we do in this little moment will echo and echo and echo and echo. and the echoes get larger as you go. When I think of how do we protect faith, doing the little things is a great place to start. And obviously, like spiritual disciplines, you know, like things like confession, prayer, like all of that stuff, absolutely amazing. But I think, like, I always look at it this way. It always goes back to this. How free do you want to be? And I see it as an opportunity. I've lived life 100 different ways, and I really just feel like at the end of the day, this is what I've put in a stake in the ground and just said, I'm invested in this. I may waver a little bit from that. I may go back and forth. But I'm just waking up every day saying, where can I go a little bit further with God? That's the big question. Because if I go a little bit further right now, if it puts me a little bit more on trajectory, I'm that much closer 10 years from now, 20 years from now, an eternity from now. And the good and evil that we do increases at compound interest. And so yeah, I guess like protecting that faith is knowing how important it is in the long run. Do we actually have the picture of who we're going to be? You know, when you go to a personal trainer, I went to a personal trainer for the first time when I was like 25, and they did such an interesting thing with me. They were like, what are your goals? And I was like, what are my goals? I mean, I don't know. I thought you would tell me. I thought I was going to just like get skinny, have a perfect body, maybe be healthy. I don't know. And they were like, we need to know your goals from the get-go. What do you like long to be? And the reason they asked you that question is because you will never stick to anything unless you have a long-term trajectory of what the goal is. When people are showing you, you know, there's two ways to basically lose weight. One way is to show you the picture of you as a fat person and say, don't you not want to look like this? The second is to say, don't you want to look like this? And I believe the Christian life is that great picture of who you can be, and God's always saying, don't you want to look like this? Don't you want to look like this? And the truth is that you do. That's who you want to be. And so it's not shame. It's actually a faith journey of getting closer and closer and closer to the person that you ultimately desire to be. How do you cultivate that? Small, little acts every day. Take these behaviors, flesh them out, keep walking in them, and see what happens. All right, so that's the last question, and only 20 of you have dropped off the live stream since I've started the question, so not bad. For those of you who stuck around, I really appreciate it. Hey, next week we're in week 5, which is going to be book 4, and we're going to wrap this whole thing up. Week 4 is pretty compelling because you may not have noticed this, but we've been walking through the entire thing almost like, so we're getting deeper and deeper into the Christian faith, and the cool thing about the last night is, what's the point of the whole thing? C.S. Lewis talks about what transformation actually looks like theologically and actually like for real, like experientially. And so next week we're going to say, all right, this all culminates in this one final act. Who are we going to be? And I can't wait to talk with you guys about it. So thank you so much for sticking through some of the sound problems. We'll make sure we get it resolved. Going to have no more issues, and I'm super pumped to be with you all next week.